Most people who grow up famous do so because of something they did. Elizabeth Olsen grew up famous because of her last name. And the difference between those two things, between fame you earned and fame you inherited, is something she spent the first decade of her career quietly, determinedly fighting against. Not loudly, not with complaints or interviews about how unfair it was. Just with work. Relentless, deliberate, serious work. Until the work became impossible to ignore. Let's start with what it was actually like to grow up as the third Olsen. Because Mary-Kate and Ashley were not just famous, they were a cultural phenomenon. By the time Elizabeth was old enough to understand what her family was, her sisters were already two of the most recognizable faces in America. There were dolls, movies, clothing lines, magazines. The Olsen twin brand was everywhere. And Elizabeth was in the background of all of it. The little sister who came along to events, who grew up around cameras and sets and the machinery of celebrity, but who was never the one the cameras were pointed at. Most people would have used that proximity to fame as a shortcut. Elizabeth Olsen looked at it and decided she wanted nothing to do with it. When she decided to become an actress, she made a very specific choice. She didn't use her sister's connections. She didn't leverage the Olsen name to get meetings. She didn't walk into auditions as Mary-Kate and Ashley's little sister. She went to acting school, serious acting school, the Tisch School of the Arts at NYU, then a program at the Moscow Art Theater School, and she trained. She learned the craft. She paid attention to technique the way you do when you know you have something to prove. And when she started auditioning, she auditioned as herself, not as an Olsen. Just as Elizabeth, just as an actress. And then came Martha Marcy May Marlene, and this is the moment everything changed. A small independent film about a young woman escaping from a cult with almost no budget, no marketing, no stars. Elizabeth Olsen walked into that role and delivered a performance so controlled, so internally complex, so quietly devastating that critics who had never thought about her before suddenly couldn't stop writing about her. She was nominated for every major independent film award. She was on every best of list. And the conversation shifted overnight, not from Mary-Kate and Ashley's sister to actress, but from unknown to genuinely extraordinary. That film didn't just launch her career, it announced exactly what she was capable of, and what she was capable of turned out to be something very few people in Hollywood can do. Now, here is something that most people don't know about how Elizabeth Olsen ended up in Marvel. She didn't walk into those auditions with the confidence of someone who already knew they belonged there. She has talked about how intimidating the process was, how the scale of the Marvel universe, the existing fan base, the weight of stepping into a role with that much existing mythology attached to it, all of it made her genuinely nervous. And Wanda Maximoff was not an easy entry point. The character had a complicated comic book history that meant different things to different fans. She was coming into a franchise that was already massive and already had its own established tone, and she had to find a way to make this character her own without alienating the people who already had a version of Wanda in their heads. She did it through homework. She has talked about how much time she spent researching the character, reading the comics, understanding the emotional logic of someone who had grown up with nothing, lost everything, and developed powers she didn't ask for and didn't know how to control. She didn't approach Wanda as a superhero. She approached her as a person, as someone with a specific psychology and a specific wound and a specific way of moving through the world that came directly from that wound. And that decision to play the humanity first and the power second is what made her version of Wanda different from every other superhero performance in the franchise. But let's talk about what happened with Marvel for a moment, because Elizabeth Olsen has been one of the most valuable assets in that entire universe, and the way the franchise treated her is a conversation that needed to happen much sooner than it did. She appeared in multiple films, always delivering, always elevating every scene she was in, and for years, her character existed primarily in relation to other characters. Wanda's story was always in service of someone else's story. Her grief, her trauma, her power, all of it was used to drive other people's plots forward. and Elizabeth Olsen played all of it beautifully, while waiting for the moment when Wanda would finally get to be the center of her own story. That moment came with WandaVision, and what Elizabeth Olsen did with that show is genuinely one of the most impressive performances in the history of streaming television, and almost nobody in the mainstream awards conversation treated it that way at the time. The show required her to perform in the style of 5 different decades of American sitcoms, while simultaneously carrying the emotional weight of a grief narrative that was legitimately devastating. She had to be funny in the specific way that 1950s TV was funny, and then 1970s TV, and then 1980s, and do all of it while making sure the audience always felt the real story underneath. The technical demands alone were extraordinary, and she made it look effortless, which is the most dangerous thing a performer can do, because when something looks effortless, people assume it was easy. And then the Emmy nominations came out, and Elizabeth Olsen was not on the list. And the reaction from the entertainment industry, from critics, from fellow actors, was immediate and unanimous. This was a snub, not a mild oversight. A genuine, significant, embarrassing snub. People who work in television, people who understand what that performance required, said publicly that it was one of the most unjust omissions in recent Emmy history. And Elizabeth Olsen's response to all of it was characteristically dignified. She didn't campaign. She didn't give bitter interviews. She said she was disappointed because she was, and then she moved on because she had done the work. The work was there. Whether the awards caught up to it or not was not something she could control. Now let's talk about who Elizabeth Olsen actually is away from the sets and the press tours, because this is where she is most different from the celebrity image that surrounds her. She is deeply private, not in a reclusive way. She gives interviews. She's engaging and funny and thoughtful in public, but she keeps the actual substance of her personal life almost entirely to herself. Her relationship with musician Robbie Arnett, her engagement, her private life in general, she shares almost none of it. Not because she's hiding anything, but because she made a decision early on that the parts of her life that actually matter to her were not going to become content. And she has held that line consistently no matter how much the industry pushes against it. She is also one of the most genuinely intellectual people working in mainstream Hollywood right now. She reads constantly. She's talked about her interest in philosophy, in literature, in the kind of ideas that don't come up in Marvel press junkets. She takes acting workshops between projects. She studies. She treats her craft as something that can always be developed further, rather than something she has already mastered. And that attitude, the attitude of someone who is always still a student, is part of why she keeps getting better, because she never stopped paying attention. And here's something that often gets overlooked about Elizabeth Olsen. Her range outside of Marvel is extraordinary, and most people have only seen a fraction of it. Her work in Sorry for Your Loss, a Facebook Watch series that almost nobody watched but that critics who found it called some of the best dramatic television of its year, showed a completely different side of her. Quiet, restrained, naturalistic. No power, no spectacle. Just a woman dealing with grief in real time. The performance was invisible in the best possible way. So internal, so honest that you forgot you were watching acting at all. And she did it while simultaneously being one of the biggest names in the biggest franchise on the planet. That ability to move between those two completely different scales of work without losing anything in either direction is something very few people can do. Let's also talk about the sisters conversation, because it is impossible to talk about Elizabeth Olsen without addressing it, and she has addressed it herself with more grace than most people could manage. She has said that she understands why people ask about it, why the comparison is inevitable, why her last name will always carry a specific association, and she has said that she loves her sisters and is proud of what they built. But she has also said, clearly and without apology, that she made a deliberate choice to build something different, not better, not a rejection of what they did, just different, her own thing, on her own terms. And the fact that she has actually succeeded in doing that, in becoming famous for something entirely separate from her family connection, is a rarer achievement than it sounds. And the last thing, the thing that makes Elizabeth Olsen's story genuinely compelling beyond the performances and the career choices. She has never seemed like someone who needs Hollywood to validate her. She genuinely loves acting, the craft of it, the challenge of it, the problem solving of it, in a way that is completely independent of what the industry thinks of her. When the Emmy nomination didn't come, she was disappointed but not destroyed, because her sense of whether she had done good work was not dependent on whether the Television Academy agreed. When Marvel's treatment of her character